What was supposed to be a fresh start turned into chaos when my parents raised my rent to support my brother. I left, but now they're freaking out, and everything is unraveling fast. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we have a powerful story about someone facing a situation that many of us can relate to: feeling trapped in a toxic environment. Constantly sacrificing your own well-being for the sake of others. Have you ever been in a position where you felt stuck, with no way out, but knew deep down that you had to make a change? In this story, our main character goes through a transformation, making one of the hardest decisions of their life. Stick around until the end to see how they find the courage to take control and start over. It's a journey of self-discovery, empowerment, and standing up for your own happiness. And before we dive in, I would really appreciate it if you could help me reach 1,000 subscribers soon. It would really motivate me to keep sharing more impactful stories like this. Let's get started. Ever felt like you were invisible to your own family? Like no matter how hard you tried, no one saw you for who you truly were, just a source of support? That's how I felt living in my parents' house. My name is Nathan Dwyer, a 27-year-old software developer, and up until recently, I was living in the room I grew up in. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not some deadbeat mooching off my parents. I've been independent since I was 18. I work full-time as a web developer, I pay my own bills, and I've been saving for years to start my own tech startup. But there's one thing I can't seem to escape: my older brother, James Dwyer. James, 30, is what people in the family like to call the golden child. He can do no wrong. He's that guy who flunked out of college not once, but twice, bounced from job to job, and still got all the love and attention. Meanwhile, I stayed in the background, doing everything by the book. The only reason I still lived with my parents was the rent situation. Living in this city is expensive, and the rent was too high for me to afford a decent place on my own. So, when I moved back in at 18, I thought it was a win-win. I helped out with bills, paid my monthly $400 rent, and still had easy access to work. But that's when the chaos began. James? He didn't pay a dime. He bounced in and out of jobs, spent his money on half-baked business ideas, and never contributed a cent to the house. But my parents? They acted like he was the next coming of Elon Musk. While I was sacrificing, they fawned over him. Always. Then, about a month ago, my phone rang. It was my mom, and she sounded a little frantic. "James and his family need a place to stay," she said. "They're between homes right now." I could tell right away what that meant. James and his wife, Rachel, had managed to get themselves evicted. James had sunk his money into some shady investment scheme. A cryptocurrency scam, of course. I'm not saying I'm surprised, but it wasn't the first time this had happened. Without even asking me, my parents told James and Rachel they could move in. And just like that, my once peaceful home turned into a circus. James, Rachel, their 2 kids, and their dog, a crazy little golden retriever named Max, were now living under the same roof as me. Suddenly, everything was chaos. Living under the same roof as my parents and James' family quickly turned into a nightmare I never could have imagined. It wasn't just the space, it was the noise. The screaming kids, the dog barking nonstop, the clutter everywhere. My office? Gone. That spare room I used to work in? Now it was packed with James stuff. Bookshelves, old furniture, kids' toys, and piles of random boxes. And me? I was shoved into my old bedroom, a room that was never meant to be a home office. But what really killed me? Despite all this, I was still paying $400 rent. While James and his family lived here for free, they didn't contribute anything. Not a single penny. Nothing. I tried to be patient, but every day it felt like I was suffocating. Couldn't work. No peace. No privacy. No respect. It wasn't that I wanted everything to go back to the way it was, it's just that I felt like I was losing myself in this endless cycle. Every morning when I woke up, I heard the kids arguing from far away, the sound of James' footsteps in the hallway, Max, their dog barking loudly, and the constant running around of the kids throughout the house. It honestly felt like I was imprisoned in my own home. I could no longer have even a single moment of peace, not even for a minute. One evening, as I was sitting in the living room, trying to get some work done on my laptop, James walked in with that smug grin of his. He walked right past me, without a word, and sat down in the chair across from me as if I didn't exist. I could barely hear myself think because of the noise around me. He started talking about his latest business ventures. This had become part of his routine. He spoke without even noticing that I was struggling to focus while the house was in utter chaos. "Oh, by the way," he said with that grin, "Rachel and I are thinking of going out this weekend. You think you could babysit for us?" That comment hit me like a slap in the face. He didn't even ask me, just assumed I'd drop everything and look after his kids. I tried to refuse, but before I could get the words out, Rachel popped her head in from the kitchen, smiling sweetly as usual. "Oh, Nathan," she said, her voice soft. "It'll only be for a few hours. The kids love spending time with you. It's just one night. One night, that's how they saw it. A simple favor." But what they didn't realize was it was never just one night. Every time I thought it was just a one-time thing, they kept asking for more. And I kept giving. It was like I was a machine, endlessly giving with no stop. Since they moved in, I slowly started to feel like I wasn't even human anymore. My office had been taken over, and now it was just piled with James things. And the only private space I had, my bedroom, wasn't even mine anymore. The kids kept running through the house. Max kept running around the room, knocking things over, and nobody bothered to stop him. "He's just a puppy," they'd say. But that wasn't the problem. The problem was the complete lack of respect. My mom always told me that family is supposed to help each other, that family helps family. But did anyone ask me how I was doing? I couldn't even remember the last time I had a quiet space to work or just take a break for a minute. Instead, I was constantly worried about who was going to ask me for help next. Then one day, after a long, exhausting day at work, I couldn't focus anymore. I decided to step away from my room and into the living room for a bit of stress relief. But no, it was still the noise. And there was James, still talking about his business plans, completely oblivious to how tired I was. He could sit there for hours, not once acknowledging how I was struggling to get any work done with the constant interruptions. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, he made another request, as though it was a given. "You think you could watch the kids tonight? We're going out." The anger inside me started to rise like a wave. I felt like I wasn't even myself anymore. Even now, as I was trying to keep my cool, James just kept pushing me into a situation where I couldn't say no. Every request they made was another hit to my patience. Simple questions, simple favors, but they never ended. And then I realized, if I didn't stand up for myself, I would always be the puppet in this family. The tipping point came one fateful night, a night that I can still feel deep in my chest. I came home after another long day at work, hoping to find a moment of peace, a sliver of tranquility amidst the chaos. But what I found instead shattered whatever patience I had left. There, in the middle of the living room, lay my $200 headphones torn apart. Not just scratched, not just the wires chewed at the ends, but completely destroyed. The leather ear pads ripped. The wire frayed in every direction, the once precious gift from my best friend now reduced to a useless pile of garbage. Those headphones weren't just expensive. They were a symbol of the little pleasures I had left in this suffocating house. My best friend had given them to me as a birthday gift. They represented something meaningful. Something I had worked hard for. And there, standing in the doorway, was Max, the dog. The one constant in this madness. Max, whose innocent eyes made me wonder how something so destructive could come in such a small package. But no, it wasn't Max. It was the lack of responsibility that came with owning a pet and the complete disregard for my boundaries. When I confronted James, he barely looked up from his phone. The way he shrugged it off was like a slap to the face. "It's just a dog, Nathan. It's not like he knows what he's doing." That was it. That's when the floodgates opened. That one sentence, that one line, hit me harder than anything I'd heard in weeks. It wasn't just a dog. It wasn't about the headphones. It was the fact that James never took responsibility for anything. It was the fact that I was living in a space where nothing was mine, nothing was ever safe, and nothing was respected. Every item I owned seemed to have an expiration date on it when it came to this household. It was always broken, always misplaced, always discarded, and nobody cared. Not James. Not Rachel. Not my parents. I had spent years trying to hold onto something, anything, in this chaotic mess. But everything was slipping through my fingers. I felt like I was fading away, becoming invisible. The things I had worked so hard for were always disrespected, broken, or stolen. And every time I tried to voice my frustrations, it was brushed off, dismissed. My feelings didn't matter. My property didn't matter. That night, I snapped. It wasn't just about the headphones anymore. It wasn't about the dog. It was everything, the constant barrage of small indignities that I'd endured for too long. The noise, the mess, the lack of privacy. The way James and his family waltzed in without a second thought and took everything for granted. How my needs were always second place to everyone else's. After the babysitting fiasco, yet another night I had been guilted into taking care of their kids when I had plans of my own. I walked into the kitchen to find James sitting with my mom. Their conversation was casual, almost too casual, and it hit me like a ton of bricks. I stood there for a moment, frozen in the doorway, trying to process what I was hearing. James was sitting there, talking about how tough things were for him as though he was the only one facing hardship. Meanwhile, I was sitting in the background, silently stewing in frustration. "You know," James said, his voice dripping with the same entitlement he always had, "I've been doing my best, but we're really struggling here. It's tough, you know? Maybe Nathan could step up and pay more rent to help with the house. We could really use it." I couldn't believe my ears. My mind was spinning. He had the audacity to ask me, to pay more rent while his entire family lived here for free. Free. And here I was, bending over backward, paying my share, doing everything I could just to be heard, and he was asking for more. More. From me. Without thinking, I interrupted. "You want me to pay more rent?" I asked, barely containing the anger rising in my throat. "While your family lives here for free." My voice cracked as I said it, but I couldn't stop it. I was shaking with rage. My mom, ever the peacekeeper, looked at me with those soft, sympathetic eyes, the same ones she always had when she didn't want to take sides. "It's family, Nathan," she said, her voice so calm it made my blood boil. "We help family." That was it. That was the final straw. Her words hit me like a slap across the face. I couldn't process it. I couldn't breathe. Family helps family? Was that the excuse? Was that how they justified everything? At that moment, something inside me broke. I felt my heart shatter in my chest. I realized that I couldn't do this anymore. I couldn't keep living this way, being constantly disrespected, used, and taken advantage of. I'd spent years trying to be the good son, the responsible one, the person who did what was right even when it felt wrong. But I was done. I couldn't keep sacrificing my own happiness for a family that didn't care about me. They took and took and took, and I gave, always giving, always thinking things would get better. But it was never enough. James would never change. My mom would never see my side. They would keep expecting more from me, and I would keep giving. I realized, standing there in that kitchen, that the only way out was to walk away. I had to leave. I had to save myself. If I stayed any longer, I would lose everything. Myself, my dignity, my sense of peace. I looked at my mom and James, both staring at me with expressions of confusion, but I couldn't stay. I turned on my heel and walked out of the room. I didn't know exactly what I would do next, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stay in this toxic environment any longer. The damage was done. And for the first time in a long time, I finally knew what I had to do. The next few days felt like a blur. Like I was moving through life in a fog, unable to see clearly. I knew I had to get out. There was no longer a question about it. I couldn't stay in this toxic environment any longer. But where would I go? That was the million-dollar question. I didn't have a plan. I couldn't just pack my bags and leave. Life wasn't that simple. The apartment market in the city was insane. Sky-high rents, with tiny apartments barely fitting a bed and a desk, asking for a small fortune. How could I possibly afford that? I barely made enough to cover my rent as it was. And now I was expected to fork out even more just to live somewhere that might not even feel like home? My savings were minimal. I hadn't had the time or the space to focus on anything other than surviving. I felt trapped, suffocated by the walls of this house that had once been my home but was now a prison. Every corner of the place was a reminder of what I was losing, of what I had already lost. My own sense of peace, my autonomy, my independence. It was all slipping through my fingers. Just like the headphones, just like the time I would never get back. There was no clear path forward, no easy way out. And that realization hit me like a ton of bricks. For a while, I had convinced myself that I could handle it, that things would eventually get better. But now, as I stood at the crossroads of my own life, I felt like I was suffocating in my own skin. Then, as if the universe was throwing me a lifeline, I got a call from an old friend, Chris. I hadn't talked to him in months and I had almost forgotten how it felt to hear his voice. He was one of the few people who had seen me when I was actually myself, before all this chaos started, before I became someone who barely recognized himself. "Hey, Nathan," Chris said. Sounding casual, but there was something familiar and warm in his tone. "It's been a while. How's everything going?" I hesitated, unsure of how to explain the mess my life had become. But instead of going into everything, Chris quickly cut in with a piece of news that made my heart leap. "So, my roommate is moving out in 3 weeks," he said. "And there's a room opening up in my place. Rent's cheaper than what you're paying now, and it's a decent spot. I know things are crazy right now, but if you need a place, it could be perfect for you." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My mind immediately raced through the logistics. Moving to a new city apartment, the new start, the possibility of breathing space. It wasn't just a room. It was a chance to get away. Rent was cheaper than I expected, and suddenly the idea of being free, of finally having control over my own life again, felt real. A way out. I signed the lease without thinking twice, like my hand was moving on its own. Driven by desperation and relief, the weight that had been crushing me for weeks began to lift, if only for a moment. I had a way out. I could finally take control of my life again. But even with the excitement of this new beginning, something gnawed at me. I didn't want to tell my family just yet. I couldn't bring myself to face them, not until I was ready. Not until I had something solid to show for myself, something that was mine, something I could call my own again. I didn't know how they'd react, but I could already feel the tension building in my chest. I knew they wouldn't understand. Instead, I started moving my things out quietly, little by little. When no one was around, I began packing up my things, my clothes, my personal items, things I had once considered small treasures but now felt like lifelines. Every box I packed and carried out to the car was a small act of defiance against the life I had been living. It was the only way I could reclaim my space, my dignity, and my future. But it wasn't easy. The guilt clawed at me constantly. Every time I moved something out, I felt like I was betraying my family. They still didn't know what I was doing, and I was afraid of what would happen when they found out. I spent each day pretending everything was normal. I carried on with my routine, made small talk at dinner, did my part in the house, all while my heart raced with the knowledge that I was leaving. I was living in 2 worlds. One foot still planted in the chaos I was escaping from, and the other stepping into a future I wasn't sure I was ready for. And every night, as I returned to my room, I felt the weight of the situation press down on me. I had been so careful, but the pressure was overwhelming. I was suffocating, not just physically but emotionally. It felt like I was holding my breath, waiting for the moment when everything would come crashing down, when they would find out what I was doing. The moment I would have to face them. But still, every time I packed up something else, every shirt, every book, every photo that I'd kept close to me through all of this, I couldn't help but feel a sense of liberation. It was slow, it was quiet, but it was happening. I was breaking free, step by step, and with every small decision to move forward, I was reminded of the person I used to be, the person I was fighting to be again. The fear of leaving, of facing the unknown, was still there. But the fear of staying, of sinking deeper into this suffocating life, was worse. I knew I couldn't turn back now. It was only a matter of time before everything would change. And maybe, just maybe, that would be the best thing that ever happened to me. I couldn't deal with the guilt anymore. It gnawed at me. This constant ache in the pit of my stomach. My family still thought I was just trying to stick it out for the sake of peace. But I was done. I couldn't be the peacekeeper anymore. I had been doing it for so long, pretending that everything was okay when it wasn't. Pretending that I was fine with the noise, the chaos, the total lack of respect for my personal space. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. And I could no longer silence the voice in my head that screamed at me to leave, to free myself. I packed up everything: clothes, gadgets, important documents. Anything that was mine, anything that I had worked hard for, anything that still meant something to me. I didn't even have the strength to organize or fold things neatly. Everything was in a rush. Tossed into bags, shoved into boxes. The urgency, the desperation I felt pushed me forward faster than I ever thought I could move. Every item I put into the car felt like one less thing I had to leave behind. One more step closer to freedom. The weight of guilt was suffocating. I had been avoiding this for so long. Making excuses, telling myself that maybe things would get better. That if I just held on a little longer, everything would fall into place. But that night, something inside me snapped. It wasn't just the chaos anymore. It wasn't just the disrespect. It was the years of putting everyone else's needs ahead of mine. It was the feeling of being invisible in my own home, the constant erosion of my own self-worth. I couldn't keep doing it. At 5 a.m. on that cold Friday morning, the world outside still covered in darkness, I loaded up my car. I had nothing left to say. No more goodbyes. No more trying to explain myself. The silence was my only friend now. The silence that came when I knew I couldn't stay a moment longer, but also couldn't bring myself to say the words aloud. James and Rachel were still sleeping. Their kids were still nestled in their beds, completely unaware of what was happening. I could hear the faint sound of snoring coming from the master bedroom. I knew that I had to leave before anyone woke up, before anyone could stop me. I didn't want to face the looks, the questions, the disappointment. I couldn't bear to look at their faces and see how they'd react. I didn't want to feel the weight of their guilt, their anger, or their confusion. I wasn't ready for that. Maybe I never would be. As I carried the last box to the car, I couldn't help but pause for a moment. The house stood there, silent, almost ominous in the early morning light. It had been my home for so many years, but now it felt like a prison. The place where I had once felt comfort was now a place that drained me. And yet, there I was, preparing to leave it all behind. I stood in front of my car for a second, taking in the dark street, the cold air, and the haunting silence that seemed to wrap around me. The only sound was the faint hum of the car engine as I started it up. The headlights cut through the dark, illuminating the driveway for a brief moment before I slowly pulled away. My heart raced in my chest. I didn't even look back. There was nothing left for me to hold on to. I was leaving, and this time I was not coming back. The drive was a blur. I didn't want to listen to the radio, didn't want to hear the world outside my own head. I just needed the quiet, the silence. It felt surreal, like I was on autopilot, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts, yet none of them clear enough to focus on. The hum of the tires on the road, the occasional flicker of the streetlights as I passed, these were the only things that anchored me to reality. Leaving felt like a release, but there was also a deep undercurrent of sadness. It wasn't just the house I was leaving behind. It was the life, the family, the expectations that had been forced on me. And even though I had made the decision, even though I knew it was the right one for my mental health, there was a part of me that couldn't help but mourn. I had been part of this family for so long, and now I was walking away. I had no idea what the future held, but I knew I couldn't keep living for others. I thought about James and Rachel, still sleeping in their comfortable bed, oblivious to what was happening. A wave of anger surged through me. James, who had never taken responsibility for anything, who had taken advantage of my kindness for so long, was still in his comfortable little bubble, not having to face the consequences of his actions. Rachel, who always smiled sweetly but never really saw what was going on beneath the surface, would likely be angry when she found out. And the kids? They'd probably never even know why I was gone. That thought alone was enough to make my chest tighten. They were innocent in all of this, but I couldn't keep living under the same roof with them. As I passed the familiar streets, my thoughts drifted to the countless times I had let my frustrations bubble under the surface, only to silence them for the sake of keeping the peace. I had been a good son, a good brother, always trying to make everyone happy, always trying to fix things. But that day was different. That was the day I stopped sacrificing my own happiness for others. I don't know exactly when it hit me, but somewhere in the middle of that drive, I felt a strange sense of relief. I was free. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But for the first time in months, maybe even years, I could breathe again. The weight that had been on my shoulders for so long started to lift. As I drove away, the distance between me and my old life grew. I wasn't sure what was ahead. I didn't know where I would go from here. But for the first time, I felt like I had control over my life again. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I could be me again. It wasn't easy. The guilt, the manipulation, the silent treatment, it all came crashing down the moment I moved out. I knew it was the right thing to do, but that didn't stop the emotional weight from crashing over me. I had been planning this for weeks, trying to work out the logistics, trying to convince myself that I could handle the aftermath. But no amount of preparation could have prepared me for the flood of emotions that hit me the moment I stepped into Chris's apartment. The first few days after I moved in were a whirlwind. My phone buzzed relentlessly with texts, each one from a different family member, demanding an explanation. My mom, her voice shaky with concern, bombarded me with questions. Why didn't you tell us? Why are you doing this to the family? The words hit me like a ton of bricks, but I knew I couldn't go back. I had made my decision. And then, of course, there were the calls, endless calls, almost all from James and Rachel. James sounded frustrated and angry. You think you can just walk away from everything? You're abandoning us when we need you the most. His voice, once so familiar, now felt distant, almost like a distant echo of the man I had once called my brother. Every word he spoke felt like another weight pressing on my chest. But I didn't give in. I didn't need to explain myself to them. I didn't owe them an explanation. The truth was, I had been carrying their emotional baggage for so long, walking on eggshells, constantly sacrificing my own peace of mind for the sake of keeping the peace in the family. The guilt I felt in those first few days was immense, but it wasn't the kind of guilt that should have weighed me down. It was the kind of guilt that was rooted in the manipulation and emotional control they'd always had over me. Every call, every text, every manipulation tactic they threw my way was designed to make me feel bad, to make me question my decision. But I knew better. I had to save myself, and for the first time in years. I wasn't going to let anyone guilt-trip me into staying in a situation that was suffocating me. The moment I moved into Chris's apartment, I could finally breathe. There was no more constant noise, no more interruptions, no more expectations. I wasn't tied down by anyone's needs, and I could finally think clearly without the constant pressure weighing on me. I could remember what it was like to be me again. The first few days of solitude felt like a gift. Chris's apartment was simple, nothing extravagant, but it was mine. It was quiet. It was peaceful. For the first time in months, I woke up in the morning without feeling like I was walking into a battlefield. No kids screaming, no dog barking incessantly, no one telling me what to do or how to feel. It was just me, my thoughts, and the endless possibilities ahead. As I sat at the small desk in the corner of the room, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in so long. I could focus. I could breathe. I could start planning again, not just for my next move, but for my future. There was no pressure to be someone else, to live up to anyone else's expectations. I could finally focus on my goals, on my dreams, and on my future. It was liberating. Of course, the guilt still lingered. It didn't just disappear overnight. There were moments when I'd check my phone and see a text from my mom or a missed call from James, and I would wonder if I was being too harsh. But every time I felt that pang of doubt, I reminded myself that I was saving myself. I was saving my sanity. My mental health had to come first. If that meant cutting ties with toxic people, then that was what I had to do. Sometimes, the best thing you can do for your mental health is to cut ties with toxic people, even if they're family. And that's exactly what I did. It wasn't an easy decision. It wasn't something I had planned on doing. But staying in that environment with the constant emotional blackmail, the guilt, the control, I knew that wasn't something I could live with anymore. There was a part of me that felt like I was betraying my family, like I was abandoning them in their time of need. But I had to realize that I wasn't responsible for fixing everything. I wasn't responsible for carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders anymore. For the first time in my life, I was taking care of me. I started waking up early to work on the things that really mattered to me. I hadn't had the mental space to do that in so long. It felt strange, in a good way, to be able to focus on something I actually cared about. I began working on my personal projects again, something I had completely put on hold while I was trying to manage the chaos at home. I found that small sense of fulfillment again, the kind of fulfillment that didn't come from trying to please others but from doing something that made me feel alive. That made me feel like I was moving towards something bigger. And as the days went by, the guilt began to fade. Not completely, but enough for me to see the bigger picture. I was no longer a prisoner to my family's expectations. I was no longer bound by their manipulation. I was free. And for the first time in a long while, I felt proud of myself. In the end, I'm finally building the life I've always dreamed of. No distractions, no guilt. Just me, my goals, and the future ahead. I have a sense of purpose again. Something I had lost in the chaos of my old life. My new life isn't perfect. It's still a work in progress, but I'm moving in the right direction. I have control over my own decisions, my own happiness, and that's something I never thought I'd get back. And as much as I know my family will never understand, I can live with that. I've chosen myself, and I have no regrets. So, what do you think about this story? Do you have any thoughts or feelings you'd like to share? Feel free to leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your opinions and reactions. And don't forget to like the video if you enjoyed the story and found it meaningful, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next exciting story. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. There's definitely more to come, and I look forward to accompanying you on these journeys ahead. Stay connected, and I hope to see you in the next story.